dungeons always have to start with some sort of creative spark. Ideally, we have something really cool visually to leverage so that we know what we're going to be building and we kind of know a little bit about the area. Sometimes we have to start from just something as simple as a quick little one-paragraph write-up that describes, the people of the zone, or the architecture of the zone, or sort of the feel and just the general philosophy of the area. Regardless, we start, and the first thing we do is write like a quick little one-page idea or brief that just describes what the designer is thinking. See how that jives with the concepts, see how that jives with the high-level creative thinking for both the area and the game as a whole. And once that's approved, we just start the process of passing it through the various different creative fields we have. So if we don't already have concepts, we'll get concept artists to start drawing some cool stuff based off what they've seen in the initial write-up. Writers will start to come up with characters for the areas, storylines for the areas, maybe a hook for the dungeon that really helps tie the whole thing together. I think one of the trickiest things in Darksiders 1 was really figuring out what our philosophy for dungeon design was. And one of the core themes for the game now and for the franchises, within the dungeons, having some sort of a theme that wraps the dungeon up into a nice package that sort of makes each dungeon memorable. Oh, that was the dungeon where you carried the big swords around, or oh, that was the dungeon with the spiders, or that was the dungeon that took place in the subway, so that long after they're done playing the game, they can describe the dungeons in some short one-sentence format. So getting that early on is probably the biggest challenge. So finding some way between the concepts, the write-ups, the paper maps, the design brief, to give the dungeon some sort of sex appeal. That's really the first step, and that can manifest in a number of different ways. The process really isn't set in stone. We like to say that there's a very specific way that dungeon design happens, but it's usually much more creative and collaborative than any straight linear structure for developing something. But once we have that and we're pretty confident with the basic idea for the dungeon, just sort of the core theme, we start with the paper map. So we'll go into some sort of a 2D tool, like Illustrator is our particular preferred one, but sometimes it's just a whiteboard. We even got a chalkboard just as a different way of sparking creativity. We actually lay something out in 2D so we can get an idea of the flow. We can see where the key elements are going to be placed. Get an idea for the pacing, because obviously pacing is one of the things that's most important in making sure a dungeon comes off successfully. So room by room or section by section, making sure that there's an adequate pacing of combat to puzzle solving to traversal. Because Darksiders has such an eclectic mix of stuff to do, balancing them all so that the player isn't overloaded with one or the other is a big challenge, especially because the dungeons tend to be non-linear. So making sure that even as the gameplay is wrapping back on itself, that pacing is maintained is a huge challenge. But ultimately, it's not until you get something into 3D and you see it in 3D space that you can really see the idea come to light. And that's probably when the wheels start turning the fastest. So the whole dungeon is built using a comprehensive set of modular pieces that make it very easy to make changes to the shape of the room. I think in the end, players really aren't going to be able to tell that this was built using these, essentially what is a big set of Legos to make everything. But because we do it this way, it's one of the reasons we're going to have such a large number of dungeons in Darksiders 2 compared to Darksiders 1, because we have the flexibility to create dungeons and gameplay very, very quickly, whereas Darksiders 1 was all custom built using tools like 3D Studio Max. And one of the nice things about our tool is that it's easy to iterate, because we can just hit play on the fly and drop right down in to test out gameplay. One of the things that's very important for visual games in general, and in particular on the Darksiders franchise, is being able to iterate on gameplay quickly. So if we're seeing that a particular design idea or element of the room isn't working, it's very easy for us to stop and start the game on the fly to make changes that are appropriate for the design. We have a word for a puzzle that's not a puzzle, which is nuzzle, which is a very clever combination of not a puzzle. You start to reveal the elements that will add up to a puzzle later individually, so that the player gets the rules. They start to understand the ingredients that the puzzles are going to be made of. So you have to do that slowly and in an environment that makes it pretty obvious, clear, easy. And then you add up to something that's a lot more difficult. You have to throw a few softballs at the player so that they get comfortable and they understand the rules of the world, and then you hit them over the head and knock them out. When a designer is working on his own puzzle, it's really hard to see the forest for the trees, because you know exactly what you're supposed to do. So you sometimes just take for granted how easy it's going to be for players to figure that same, or come to that same conclusion. And so you start putting it in the line of fire and you realize how quickly it is, how easy it is to fill it full of holes. And so the designer ends up working very hard to make sure that the things the player needs to be doing and seeing and thinking about, the pieces of the puzzle, are all clearly communicated. And so things start to get moved around, whether it's the actual puzzle elements moving or elements of the visual design of the room changing to direct the player's eye. It inevitably means that the puzzles just get nerfed. But yeah, it almost always has to do with how the puzzle is being visually communicated. It's not very often that the actual essence of the puzzle gets changed, where a puzzle is just fundamentally flawed. It's usually just tweaking it so that the player has an easier time coming to the correct conclusion. Because you don't want to make it obvious. You don't want to throw everything into their face. Finding that balance where some people get a little bit confused and other people, some people get it pretty quickly, is tricky, but that's what it's all about. It's just making sure that visually the communication is there so that you don't feel like you're hiding anything from the player. Having the puzzle survive that process is tough. It's tricky. But we have to make sure we do that at what we call the blue room stage, when everything is just blocked out and roughed out. And that's probably where the design portion of the dungeon is the most iterated on, because once we're in 3D and because we have a really nice set of modular pieces, it's easy for us to just make changes on the fly based on player feedback. So we get people playing the dungeon a lot. We'll get guys from the 40K team in to run through and get a different perspective on it. As we see problems arising, we're in there fixing them on a minute-by-minute, day-by-day basis. Once everyone's confident that the blue room is strong, the puzzles are good, the combat is good, the flow is good, we're pretty sure that the pacing works. At that point, we just kind of let it sit for a while, and it just gets played over and over and over again. Because inevitably what happens, and what happened a lot on Darksiders 1, is 2 weeks after a dungeon is done, somebody gets the big idea. Somebody gets the, oh shit, we should totally do X, Y, or Z that completely changes the dungeon. And as long as it's sitting in the blue room stage, we can sort of manage that type of creative burst. But once you've started putting art in the dungeon, forget about it. It's just got to keep going. So we let it sit and gestate for a little while. And then once everyone's pretty confident that it's going to be good, it's going to be great, we hand it off to the artists. And at that point, they take the modular art set and really start fleshing it out and making it beautiful. And even in that stage, though, it's inevitable that there's design iteration, because the art starts to go in and you start to see the player's eye get directed one place or another within the room, or you start to see how traversal is or isn't going to work, because what a designer may have set up in the traversal path may not really be feasible for building out with art, because it won't make any sense architecturally or structurally, or it doesn't fit what the particular race that inhabits this zone would do with their space. So there's a lot of feedback between art and design day by day to make sure that the gameplay is supported while making sure that the room meets Vigil's pretty high visual bar. So we need to have very strong collaboration. And luckily we have a pretty veteran art and design team now, so they can collaborate and they work very, very easily and very, very effortlessly together to make sure that both of those goals are met. And once it's arted up, it looks good, it just sits for a while, and we just try not to break shit. That's it. Once it's done, we're just trying not to break stuff, and we just let it ride out till the game's done. We wear our inspirations on our sleeves, and at our core, we're all just gamers. We just guys who love games, and it's often said in design that one of the cardinal rules not to break is to design for yourself and just to make something that you want to play, but I think we're all guilty of it here. So the games that we grew up loving are the games that we are trying to, that's the genre we want to participate in. And I think what we've done to make Darksiders unique from those is add in elements that you don't usually get in some of those other games, like truly intense action. And then in Darksiders 2, a full loot system, very advanced traversal. Those aren't usually things you see in combination with one another. So I think when players are done playing Darksiders 2 and they ask themselves, or they're telling their friends about what made Darksiders 2 unique, they're going to talk about the alchemy of those different things and how it added up to something really special and unique. We want to make games for gamers. That's our intent. And so we hope that they can appreciate what we tried to do.